Hello, and welcome to Next Steps for Seniors, Conversations on Aging. I'm your host, Wendy Jones, and as you all know, my goal is really to get good information out there so that we, all of us, can age gracefully, with dignity, and be informed about what the future holds. So we're here today talking about the future you. So I am hoping that this topic doesn't cause you fear. I'm hoping that this topic that we're about to talk about isn't uncomfortable. I hope that you are thinking in your head, wow, I really wanted to know about this, but I didn't know how to ask the questions. So you ready what the topic is today? Funeral services. Yes, I said it. Funeral services. Now, it seems like a heavy topic, but I'm going to give you something really light to think about. Every single person in the entire world has to go through this. We're not alone. So why are we talking about this? Because a lot of people have questions, and including myself. And that's why we're talking about it, because I've never been in a situation yet that I personally have had to walk into a funeral home and make big decisions in a short order. So my guest today is Cheryl Marshall. Hi, Cheryl.
Hello.
Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
And you've been in the industry, I guess we can say, for how long?
About 25 years.
25 years. So I'm guessing you know a few things about funeral services.
A little bit. I'll try to answer everything.
You're going to navigate us through this because I know nothing. I know that it's something that we all dread that we have to do, but it can be a beautiful thing.
It truly can.
And that's why we want to be educated on it, because the more we know now, the better it's going to be in the future for us,
That's right? Absolutely.
So tell us a little bit about, so I'm just going to give you a story. A close relative of mine passes away. And what's the first thing I do?
That's a great question, because just about everybody asks the very same thing. What do I do now? And that somewhat depends on where and how the death occurs. But we're not going to talk about all of those things because there's so many different options. But after a death occurs, the next actual thing that's necessary is notifying the funeral home of your choice. So it is really important to think about that ahead of time. As you already mentioned, probably is very uncomfortable for most people. But what I've learned over all these years of serving people is the fear associated with the thought of funeral service is the fear of the unknown. We just don't know what to do, how to do it, when, all these kind of things. So what I can tell you is it's the best topic ever to talk about hopefully long before you would ever need it.
Because then you have the confidence that you're doing exactly what your loved ones wanted.
Exactly. But here's the thing. You're doing this 100% without the emotional duress of a near death or a death that has occurred. So therefore, if you can have those conversations before there's a need, you can talk about them with reality and not have the emotional attachment that a death has occurred. Because a lot of times our common sense disappears when we're under that type of emotional duress.
Wow, isn't that interesting? That makes all the sense, though, in the world. I can imagine. So you've got to remove yourself from that. And it's so interesting because when you say you need to have a choice made, you need to make that decision, and you need to make it quick. Do people actually go into a funeral home and say, hey, do you mind if I look around and check this out for myself someday? I mean, honestly, do they do that?
Every day.
I mean,
every day.
Like, let's do this. Let's do a field trip. Call all your friends and say, hey, guys, guess what we're doing today?
Yeah.
We're all going to go on field trips. We're going to look at 3 different funeral homes and see which one we want.
Well, it's really pretty incredible because that didn't used to happen. The funeral homes were small town or the only funeral home in the area or the big one. And so that's the one everybody went to. But today things are very different. And folks actually didn't used to price shop funerals. They just were committed to the local funeral home where generations of their family have been. People actually do price shop today.
Well, and don't you feel like there's more funeral homes than there were back in the day, too?
Yes.
There's more options, right? So you can price shop. We created competition is what we did.
That's for sure. But yes, there are more funeral homes. But also, when you get today, when you get into the need for price shopping is, we all know you get what you pay for, whether it's cars or whether it's funerals. There are different levels of service and different means of taking care of families. Some are just like, if you compare it with cars, what used to be called a Chevette. It was my first car. It was just entry level, had wheels, a steering wheel, and seats, and you go, and got great gas mileage. Big difference between a Chevette and a Cadillac.
Right.
So if that makes sense.
It does.
Price shopping is important.
So you need to call the funeral home right away within the first so many hours, right? The first 12 hours? Because you need to, tell me what happens, because I'm making this up as I go along.
Well, for example, if someone is in hospice care, which there's a lot of hospice care today, if someone is in hospice care and at the time the death occurs, if the family is present, the hospice nurse needs to be called, or the facility, if they're in a hospice facility or home, the hospice nurse needs to be called if they're not present, and actually to pronounce the death. And then there's certain things that need to happen in order for the deceased to be released so that we can bring them into our care. So that could be a matter of an hour. It could be a matter of several hours, because sometimes family, once they receive the phone call that their loved one has passed away, they want to get there first to see them before the funeral home.
Yes. Of course.
Yep. And so that depends on timing sometimes. If it's a death at home, unexpected, yes, then the first call goes to the police department. The police department's going to bring in a medical examiner because they've got to determine cause of death. So it could be 12 hours by the time those things happen. So it is different depending on circumstances, which none of us ever know. I've encouraged a lot of people, don't get caught up in those kind of concerns, because we don't know what we don't know, and none of us have a crystal ball.
Well, I'll tell you, I had a senior ask me this question. This is a real question that they asked me. They said, what do you do when you wake up in the morning and the person laying in the bed next to you is gone?
That's legitimate. That's real. And it happens. And that's the case where the first phone call, you have to call the police.
Just the regular police, not 911, or do you call 911?
You would call 911.
Okay.
And just let them know.
There's a phone number you could call the police department, but 911 is the appropriate.
It would be 911. That's an emergency, and a death is an emergency. Somebody's life has just been disrupted with an emergency.
And they'll send out probably the fire truck. I think fire truck goes on every 911 call.
That I don't know.
And okay, we don't know what's going to happen, but you're going to hear sirens, and they're going to show up at your door.
Yeah. And here's the other thing in that scenario too. If that person has well-known health conditions, they're under the doctor's care, and that would not be really shocking for such a thing to happen. It still requires a call to the police department if they're not under hospice care.
Yeah. There's something about having hospice care because they manage all of this for you.
They do.
It really is a gift.
And the people who serve in hospice care, we call them angels. Every family that I've served, almost every hospice experience considers those folks angelic.
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
angels on duty. But not every situation where people's health accounts for hospice care.
Right.
Right. That's really when
They
they
die suddenly or
pending,
something.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So once the police do their investigation, the medical examiner comes out, that's when you can move the body from wherever the location it is.
Yes.
And it goes directly to...
It would go directly, we would bring them into our care.
Into the funeral home.
So the funeral home would then be the ones to come to the home. We call that a removal, where we're bringing the deceased into our care. So the only time that would not happen is in the event that the death was suspicious. In the event the death was suspicious, at that point, the deceased would then be taken into the care of the ME, the medical examiner.
We are going to be right back to talk more in our next segment, but as you can see, this is information we are all going to need to know someday. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Next Steps for Seniors, Conversations on Aging. Our topic today is funeral services. Now, I know it's a little uncomfortable, but what great information Cheryl has for us. She's been in the industry for years, 23 years, and has so much knowledge and can bring peace to this situation of the unknown. Because the reason people are fearful is because they don't know what to expect.
That's right.
So we are here today to share with you so you know what to expect and what to do when a loved one passes, so you're not fearful or wondering what's going to happen next. She's here to tell you that. So we just talked about first call is to 911, that the police come out, the medical examiner comes out if the hospice is not already involved.
Yes.
And I mean, I've seen the scenes before. They put caution tape and everything because they're really examining what the cause of death was. And you're going to almost feel, and I remember a good friend of mine, her dad passed, almost felt like, oh my gosh, why are they asking me all these questions? I hope they think I didn't do this.
Yeah.
But this is common protocol. They have to go through a course of questions. Of course, they don't think you did it. You're not guilty, but they have to ask the questions. How you found him, what he looked like, all that kind of stuff. And I remember she was there for 6 hours and she was exhausted. And I just felt my heart was so heavy because you're going through so much emotion, and to have to sit and answer all these questions and then wait and wait and wait. But this is protocol.
Yeah, it really is. I'm not aware of any yellow tape scenarios.
Okay.
The caution tape scenarios. That's when there's suspect right out the gate. But I wouldn't be concerned about anything like that. Otherwise,
If you see the caution tape, go the other way.
Yeah, that's going to make everybody think, oh my goodness, I don't want my husband or my wife to die at home. I don't want that around my yard.
Get out of the house because you're suspect if that's the case.
No, I don't think you need to be concerned about those. Those would be some pretty extreme circumstances.
Okay, so we're just cracking ourselves up over here. Who would have thought you could laugh in a service about funerals? But this is important. This topic is important. So once the removal of the body...
By the way, that reminds me, I tell people all the time, I bring the fun to funeral service.
You do bring the fun. So once the removal of the body happens, okay, so let's move through the process. That's when the family, and it doesn't matter what time it happens, right?
No, it doesn't.
They work all night long. Like,
we sure do.
This isn't a 9-to-5 job.
Nope, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Okay, so then what happens next? Now we turn the table into what the family needs to do.
Yes. And so once we've been able to bring that person into our care, our first contact, if it's during the night, usually in the morning.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking about
the caution tape. Oh, well, we're going to get over this part of it and move on. So then our contact is going to be to the family, unless the family reaches out to us. Most of the time, if a death occurs during the night, we're going to expect that family's been through a lot. We're going to reach out, usually probably after 9 o'clock in the morning, and just touch base and see how the family's doing, what their thoughts are. If, in fact, they have an idea of when they'd like to come in, because the next big step is having to make the arrangements, the things that are going to happen going forward. And so there are many, many, many options. Everybody knows burial or cremation. But here's a big thing that a lot of people don't even realize, Wendy. It's puzzling to me, but it happens all the time. Most people think if they choose cremation, you can't have any kind of services at all. It's just cremation and that's it. That is not true. So there are people who prefer cremation, but they understand the value and the need for their loved ones, close friends, family, church, anybody in their world that needs to be able to see that that person, in fact, has passed away. They need the opportunity for the reality of the death, and then also to be able to celebrate the life.
But don't you feel sometimes that's part of closure?
It absolutely.
Seeing the body is part of closure.
100%. But there are some people, and a very large majority, require that for closure and proper healthy healing. But there are some that do not. And they move forward through the grieving process in a very healthy way. That's not the majority. And most people don't realize it until they're in the middle of it.
I have one more question that I think other people might be thinking right now. What if you don't come to an understanding? Like, who's sitting in that chair? When you say the family, is it the spouse and the children or whoever wants to be there? And then who's the actual decision maker? And what happens when you have a conflict? What if one person wants one thing and another wants another? What happens in that situation?
Whew, there's a lot of answers to that question. So, first of all, I would say
23 years you've been doing this.
Gosh, yeah.
We need your expertise. We do.
Well, this is awesome, really, because people just don't know what they don't know. And you shouldn't. We don't. And so being able to listen to something like this or attend a community education program on funeral pre-planning types of things. I've done many of those, and they're unbelievably educational. But those are the things that eliminate fear, is getting answers to the questions that a lot of times people don't even know what questions to ask. So these are good. This is good. So there's lots of answers within that one question. What came to my mind, first of all, was who's the responsible party. So that would be determined by the legal next of kin. And oftentimes, if it's a husband or a wife that passes away and there are children, adult children, I prefer that children come with the parent, spouse of whoever passed away, because no one should be alone walking through a process like that. And so oftentimes it is, but the spouse would be the legal next of kin. So the kids are then able to help with decisions, express interests. Yes, I'd really like to see this happen. And when you're blindsided by a death, this happened to me personally. And when you're blindsided with a death and 12 hours later, you're sitting at a table with a funeral director and you have to answer questions that are normal, average, everyday questions, and you can't come up with the answers because you're so caught up in the grief and the loss and really even the possibility, is this really happening to me? Or is this just a horrible nightmare, and begging for someone to wake you up and tell you it is? So when you're in a scenario like that, you do need someone else to help you think.
You're relying on those people.
You are.
Leaning on them.
You are. Oftentimes, it's not one person at the arrangement conference.
I would hope not. I really would hope not.
No, it's rarely ever one person making the decisions. Whoever's determined as the legal next of kin, and maybe we can talk about that at some point too.
In the next segment. Absolutely.
Okay. And so therefore, even though there's the next of kin sitting there in the case of a spouse, It's everybody at the table that's having conversation. And that one person often leans or looks over and says, "What do you think?" "I just don't know." And so there is that sudden effort. And a lot of times this is where people struggle to make the right decision. But the guidance of the funeral director, we ask questions. We ask questions about the family. We ask questions about life, these kind of things, and just try to get to know the situation. Then we can make recommendations or at least give options, because there are so many. So big questions that happen in that there are all of the vital statistic information that has to be provided. This is for death certificates. So we have to ask those questions, and we really do need answers, which sometimes people don't know.
So you generate the death certificate? Or
yes.
Okay.
Yep, we take the information, we generate the application and submit it to the county in which death occurred, which doesn't matter what county you're in when death occurs and which county you live in. The death certificates come from the county in which death occurs. Sometimes the hospital is not in the county we live. So therefore, that's things
good
like
to know,
that.
though,
Yeah.
because people would be like, "Well, why does it have this county when I live over here?" Well,
Yep.
It's where the death occurred.
That's right. So that's where gathering information in the beginning, all the vital statistics, which also talks about marriage and family, and getting into obituary information. So by the time we get to arranging services, that's when we talk about what's going to happen next.
And obituary, we're going to get into that in the next segment, because that's a whole nother, and I would like to have mine written in advance.
I love it when that happens.
Isn't that a good idea?
Nobody writes.
This is what I'd like you to say about me. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Next Steps for Seniors, Conversations on Aging. We talk about the things that nobody else wants to talk about on this program, and it's important stuff. This is information that you just did not know. And Cheryl is here pouring her heart out, sharing information that all of us are like, wow, that's good to know. I had no idea. So I wanted to circle back on a couple of the topics that we touched on in the last two segments. And one of them was in regards to next of kin. Mm-hmm. So when you say next of kin, so talk to us a little bit about that. If both mom and dad are passed, so you said like first time the husband passes, let's say, and now the mom passes.
Yes.
Who now makes the decision if there's 3 children?
Yeah. Well, next of kin falls. I'm first going to tell you how the next of kin falls, and then we'll go back and talk about that just a little bit. So if you're married, your spouse is your legal next of kin. They would be the ones that we would make arrangements with. All final decisions come from them. If there is no married spouse, if they're not married or they're widowed, then it becomes children. So here's the thing with children. If there's one child, no problem. If there's more than one child, all children are equal legal next of kin. So I just had services for a woman who passed away, just a delightful woman. She had 11 children.
Oh my goodness.
All 11 children legally are next of kin. If they were not in full agreement, problems can happen around an arrangement table when you have all of those people. So this is where I would just say pre-planning is a thing, which many people don't even know that's possible. That's probably for a different segment. I'm not sure we'll have time.
We're going to talk about that next segment.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And so, children, when it comes to cremation, in the state of Michigan, each state has different requirements, but in the state of Michigan, majority can approve. So if you have 11 children, 6 would need to be willing to sign a cremation authorization. If only 5 will sign and 6 says, no way, I don't believe in cremation, then we cannot have the mom cremated. There has to be an agreement by majority ruling. So
Unless they did pre-planning and they already decided on cremation.
that's what a lot of people think, but that's not true.
Really?
No, even if it's pre-planned.
Mom, are you listening right now?
Even if it's pre-planned, legal next of kin at the time death occurs can alter that plan. It rarely happens. I'm telling you,
imagine.
With 25 years in funeral service, it rarely happens. So don't let that
So don't worry, Mom.
put a glitch in your giddy up.
Right.
So legal next of kin would be spouse. If there is no spouse, if you have no children, then parents fall into the legal next of kin.
Okay.
If your parents have preceded you, then siblings become legal next of kin. So that's kind of how it rolls if you're not married, if you have no children.
And then maybe half siblings? What? Because there's a lot of marriages now. We've got second and third marriages. So
Steps
what do you
and
do in
halves
that,
and things like
comes
that.
next in
So
line
it
after?
falls
Okay.
down through the line. If you have children of legal age, children equally, we talked about that. If there are no living children that have preceded you, then it would go to grandchildren. And then it would step into parents and siblings and things like that. So it just kind of rolls off. But most of the time, legal next of kin falls to a spouse or adult children.
What about power of attorney? If you have power of attorney paperwork, does that matter?
Super good question, because again, most people don't realize power of attorney ends upon death. So if you have durable power of attorney for a parent and their death occurs, then your power of attorney is null and void. You can't do any financials. You can't do banking. You can't do any of those things. It ends upon death. And common sense, health power of attorney, of course, ends at death because there's no more health power of attorney necessary.
Right.
So power of attorney doesn't matter. But what does matter is there is a legal designation in the state of Michigan called a funeral representative designation. This is the one legal document that gives every individual the right to appoint a funeral representative, and it trumps next of kin. It is a legal document. So, for example, if I just helped a gal with this, she has no spouse, she has no children, and this story kind of ended a little bit sad, but everything has worked out, is talked about the funeral representative designation, expressed the importance of that because there's no spouse, there's no living children, there's no brothers and sisters, there's no legal family, there's no family members, no family, none.
That is
Two friends. And so there was the discussion in the importance of a funeral representative designation, and it just didn't get done. And death occurred.
So now what?
Well, in some cases, we're able to figure out how that would roll. In a lot of cases, particularly cremation is disastrous in that situation if that's someone's desire. But there are times where we have to actually have the medical examiner sign the death certificate or sign a cremation authorization. And so therefore, it's so much better for you. It's so much better for your family. It's so much better for anyone that would be involved to learn these things long before you need them and plan ahead. We plan for our vacations. For crying out loud, we even plan our grocery lists. But we don't plan the one thing we know is going to happen, and most of the time unexpected.
And is a very important thing.
Well, yes.
Because all you're going to do is make it easier on your family if you've pre-planned.
If any of you as listeners have ever experienced a loss where there was a prearrangement already completed, then you know the beauty of that. It's unexplainable. It lifts a burden that is unexplainable. because you don't have to wonder, did I answer that question right? You don't have to be concerned. Am I making the right decision? Would they have chose this or would they not have? It eliminates all opportunity for an uncertainty, and it brings the peace of mind to know I did exactly what they wanted to do, because all I had to do was say, yep, that's exactly what they wanted, update any necessary information, and sign for us to carry out those wishes.
So what types of decisions are the family making when they sit there? What are they deciding on? What the casket looks like? Like, what are the questions that you're asking the family at that moment?
Generally, the way I move through that is, first of all, deciding on the type of services. So we know that starts with a question, cremation or burial.
Right.
Which would be your preference? So even if they choose cremation, okay, would you like to have traditional services, visitation that includes the body present, so there's viewing, funeral service, and then cremation, or cremation to take place first, and then maybe visitation with a memorial service?
And you can do that anywhere. You can do that at the funeral home. You can do that at a restaurant. I mean, how does this work? You can do it at a church.
Yes. Many venues. Yes.
It's up to you. And you're making those decisions at that moment as well.
Yes. I plan many services for funeral locations, and some memorial services, or more likely called a celebration of life, to happen at a restaurant, in a room, a private room. But it's set up to actually allow people the opportunity to gather together and celebrate a life. Yes, you're mourning a death. You're grieving a loss. But ideally, you're celebrating an incredible life well lived.
Exactly. This is fantastic information. This is information that not everybody gets. I mean, when you're sitting at that desk, you're probably thinking, I had no idea I would ever have to make these decisions, but we all do.
Every single one of us.
At some time or another in our lifetimes.
Yes.
We're going to have someone that's that close to us.
Yes.
That we need to make that decision.
That's exactly right.
And you're helping all of us right now, Cheryl.
Well, it's a privilege. It's an absolute honor and privilege to be able to do this. It's been something that God laid on my heart a long time ago, again, following a personal experience. And so it is with my heart. It's my job, but it's also my mission. And so it's been a privilege. And so starting with the services, the type of services, to get back to your question, following the type of services, then we know what merchandise is going to be needed to carry out those services. So that would determine whether or not there will be a casket, and then it moves on through some other things as well.
We are going to continue this conversation in our next segment, and stay tuned because we're also going to talk about pre-planning for a funeral.
Great.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to Next Steps for Seniors, Conversations on Aging. I'm Wendy Jones, your host, and we're here with Cheryl. And Cheryl is extremely knowledgeable. She's been in the funeral services industry for 23 years. And our topic right now is going to be talking about when you're sitting in a funeral home, what are the questions that you're asked? The family is asked, and what are the decisions that you need to make? And I think it's important because nobody wants to talk about this, but guess what? We do, because we have these conversations on aging, so we're better prepared for life. So let's talk about those questions, Cheryl, and then let's talk about how to pre-plan.
Okay.
Because sometimes we don't even have to answer those questions. It can all be done for us ahead of time.
That's right.
So what are those questions? You said burial or cremation?
Burial or cremation
is a big question.
Yep, that's a must.
And cremation is on a rise. From what I heard, like 50-50.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people getting cremated.
Yeah,
for
cremation.
Whatever reason.
Yeah, for whatever reason is right. And so it doesn't matter whether it's burial or cremation. As we mentioned just before we ended the last session, it's what happens between the time of death and burial or cremation. Those are the decisions that you'll decide what you believe your family will need to, first of all, face the closure of death and be able to set up for a healthy grieving experience. And so that's what really matters. Should be taken into consideration what you as an individual want, but more important at that time than what you want is, what does the people that I love the most that I'm leaving behind need. So that's a really big deal for me, because truly at that point, it's not about me. It's about my family. It's about the people I love and care about. How are they going to move forward in a world that I no longer exist? And so these are loving decisions that are made at that point in time. So the types of services, what's going to happen, and then we move into making decisions on what kind of merchandise do we need to make that plan happen. So if it's traditional services, regardless of burial or cremation, visitation, viewing, funeral service, you're going to need a casket.
Okay, so that's part of the merchandise.
Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. People used to call those coffins. Now they're called caskets. And in addition to that, if there's going to be a cemetery burial, the cemetery, not a law of any kind, state, county, none of that. The cemetery requires that the casket be placed into an outer burial container. The purpose for that is to prevent ground collapse, basically. Now that machines open and close graves, men don't. It creates a risk factor if that casket would break down. So the outer burial container prevents that from happening. The only other
So that's another purchase in addition to the casket.
It is.
See, none of us knew that. Thank you.
Yeah. And then what we call a memorial package, which the traditional register book that guests sign when they come into the funeral home, memorial folders or prayer cards for faiths that choose those. Those are given out to everyone who attends. It includes personal information and service information. And then thank you notes. So that's a merchandise item. Normally they come in packages, so it's just choosing the design and the verses that you like. Other merchandise items would fall into things like, if it is cremation, an urn, something like that. Or there's all kinds of different types of mementos and keepsakes, cremation jewelry, fingerprint jewelry that are amazing and beautiful and so meaningful. Those are merchandise items. So that would be the second section in creating a contract or the cost of a funeral. The third and final section would be what we refer to as cash advance items. These are items that we, the funeral home, facilitate all the details, but somebody else charges the fee. For example, obituaries. We put together those obituaries, we take that responsibility, we submit them to whatever newspapers the family wants them published in, but the newspaper charges the fee. Some newspapers are $600 or $700 or $800. I've had them as high as $1,200.
Really?
Yes. Then there's other papers, smaller papers, like, town papers, weekly.
Local, yeah.
Yep, just the local papers. And you can usually look for that to be an average of around maybe 140, 150, depending on the length. Then with that, we've got things like flowers or clergy honorarium, death certificates, all the things that are necessary. That's quite a list, probably too many for us to talk about. But that's how we come up with a price. So that's a necessary part of the arrangements, because that creates the contract, and the next of kin has to sign that to give us permission to move forward with those things.
So can you give us a rough idea, and I know this is like a loaded question, but on an idea of how much a funeral?
Yeah.
I mean, like a traditional funeral where you have a visitation and you go to the cemetery. Okay.
Yep. And to answer that, I would simply say cemetery expenses, opening and closing, vault placement, all the things that are necessary at the cemetery, can range from very low to extremely high. So an average, So an average of funeral services, funeral merchandise, and those third-party expenses, I will give you probably an average for traditional services anywhere between, I've had them go as around $11,000 on up to probably the most costly I've ever done has been about $19,000. And that's based on your choices.
Right. It is.
Yep.
And like you said in the beginning, the Chevette or the Cadillac.
That's right.
And you can price shop. But
You certainly
obviously
can.
this is something you'd have to do before.
That's right.
So we don't want to do that too late in the game.
No.
So talk to us about pre-planning. We only have 5 minutes left in the program.
Oh, goodness. Okay, here we
you
go.
got to do it on speed dial.
Okay. All right. You're going to have to listen fast because I'm going to talk fast. So when it comes to pre-planning, the most important things you'd want to know is do it. Call, set the appointment, and go, because I hear it week in and week out, time and time and time again. We were going to do this. We talked about it so many times. And now through tears, she's explaining we just never got around to it. We just never came. So the most important advice I would give you, make the phone call to the local funeral home and go visit and just ask the question, what's involved in pre-planning? How do I do this? When you're choosing a funeral home, visit the local funeral homes, more than one, ask for a tour. You know, look at the facility. There's lots of things to notice, cleanliness, all sorts of things. But that's a part of the pre-planning process for me, is making sure I'm choosing the right funeral home with the safety net of knowing funeral arrangements pre-planned are always transferable. So many people say we were going to, but we just weren't sure where we were. What if we moved? What if we pre-planning?
Don't wait because of that reason.
Do
Absolutely
not wait.
Not.
Transfer is every single pre-arrangement, pre-funded even. So you can pre-plan all the information, all of the decisions, all of the choices. You can also pre-fund. That too is transferable. So that's what you need to know, really important out the gate. But it is a simple conversation. There's never any obligation to pre-planning. You're simply having a conversation about what you want, learning about what your options are, and how do we move forward. But there should never be pressure.
It's fantastic. And you can even get on a payment plan too.
You can, through funeral policies. And I'm glad you brought that up. And I know we're going to run out of time.
2 minutes, you're
but
good.
There are two ways of funding pre-arrangements should you choose to prepay. Funeral policy, that's where you get the payment plan options, which is very similar to a traditional life insurance, but oh my gosh, that's a whole nother topic. Prepay guarantees today's prices, where life insurance does not. So therefore, a prepaid funeral policy is very different than a traditional whole life. You need to know that. Second funding vehicle is a funeral trust account. So there are different funding options depending on the funeral home and what they offer to the community.
So every funeral home is different, really, when it comes to this.
There's a lot of similarities, but choices of how they operate are different.
If you had to put a number on it, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but what percentage of people do you think pre-plan? Are you talking like 20%?
I would say
that come into your funeral home?
I would say probably even a little higher than that, because we are very proactive in our community about educating people.
Right. And that's why people are listening to this program, because they're being educated. And I absolutely confirm what she is saying. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I so wish I would have done that ahead of time.
100% of the time. 100% of every family would say that exact thing.
So I want listeners, thank you for tuning in, because this is information. We have conversations on aging that nobody else wants to have. So thank you for tuning into Next Steps for Seniors. I want to remind you that we are on every one of your favorite podcast platforms. So you can like, subscribe, share all this information with other people. We need to get the word out. We need to educate our seniors, our families. We need to be prepared. Life doesn't need to be chaotic, stressful. You don't need to have fear. You can have confidence and a sound mind of what the future holds for you. So thank you, Cheryl, for being here today. And God bless you for what you do every day.
Thank you so much.
It's a gift, and we need people like you talking to us when we get into that situation.
It's a privilege.
Have a blessed day, everyone. You can reach Next Steps for Seniors with any questions or comments you might have at 248-651-5010. We also have an email at hello@nextsteps4 seniors.com. So we definitely want to hear from you. Share your questions, share your thoughts, and you will definitely hear some of those answers online. Thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Next Steps for Seniors, Conversations on Aging.